Oh, excuse me. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here at the Heritage Foundation. As Director of Lectures and Seminars, it's my privilege to welcome everyone to our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium, and of course to welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. We would ask everyone in-house to make that last courtesy check that cell phones have been turned off as we proceed with the program. And we remind our Internet viewers, of course, that questions can be submitted or any comments at any time simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. We will post the program within 24 hours on our website for everyone's future reference. Hosting our event this morning is Jennifer Marshall. Ms. Marshall serves as Director of our Domestic Policy Studies and the Richard and Helen DeVos Center for Religion and Civil Society. She oversees our research in education, welfare, marriage and the family, and religion and civil society. She also manages our familyfacts.org, Heritage's online catalog of social science research related to family and religious practice. Before joining us here, she worked on cultural policy issues at Empower America, and before that, she was Senior Director of Family Studies at the Family Research Council. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer Marshall. Jennifer?
Thank you, John, and thank all of you for being here with us in our auditorium. Two major headlines of the last week remind us, sadly, just how relevant today's topic is. In Iran, the life of a Christian pastor hangs in the balance, as the Iranian authorities are determining whether to carry out a death sentence against Pastor Yusuf Nadarkhani. The charge against him? So-called apostasy, that is, converting from Islam to Christianity. Meanwhile, in Egypt, last Sunday, Christians marching to call attention to the September burning of a Coptic church were attacked and more than 20 killed. This is the worst violence in Egypt since the uprising against Mubarak's regime in January and February of this year. The violence appears to be at the hands of both military and Islamic extremists. But not only Christians are threatened by Islamist radicalism around the globe. Reports of Islamist violence against Muslim minorities are all too common as well. Against this backdrop, Muslim journalist and author Mustafa Akyol has written a new book titled Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Case for Liberty. Mustafa argues that historically, Islam has produced the seeds of freedom, but regrettably, they have not found fertile soil. Now, that comment actually appears in a part of his book about the geography and physical environment in which Islam developed. It's an example of the broad range of subjects from which Mustafa pulls to form a narrative that's very accessible for those of us in the West, very readable history of the ideas within Islam. But his comment about the seeds of freedom and the lack of fertile soil is also a metaphor for the struggle between ideas of liberty and tyranny within Islam over the centuries. That struggle, Mustafa argues, should be resolved in favor of a secular state that allows freedom from Islam while appreciating religion's contributions within a self-governing society. In other words, radical secularism should be avoided as well as religiously motivated tyranny, he says. Mustafa Akyol is a Turkish journalist, author, and speaker whose writings have appeared in the Washington Post, Newsweek, the Wall Street Journal, and the Weekly Standard. He's spoken about political, economic, and religious liberty for groups with which the Heritage Foundation works closely, including the Acton Institute, the Discovery Institute, and the Witherspoon Institute at Princeton. Today, we're very pleased to host him here at the Heritage Foundation to make a Muslim case for liberty, particularly religious liberty. Please join me in welcoming Mustafa Akyol.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks, first of all, to Heritage Foundation for hosting me here. Thank you, Jennifer, for organizing this event and for this very generous, gracious introduction. And thanks to you all for coming here this afternoon, to share the discussion, the debate on Islam and liberty. I will begin with a personal story, if you wouldn't mind, and that's also a story that I used in the beginning of my book, because it also might reflect how I come to notice this issue of this question of whether is there a clash between really Islam and freedom. I grew up in Ankara, Turkey's capital, which is not the best city when you compare it to Istanbul, but in a reasonably mildly religious family. But my grandparents were quite pious; they were very religious, and I used to spend a few summers in their house in Ankara to learn more about religion. You know, I learned how to pray, I learned how to recite the basic phrases in Islam. My grandparents were also teaching me about the basic concepts of Islam. By the way, I should maybe add that they were also fans of a U.S. series called Little House on the Prairie, which was aired in Turkey with Turkish voiceovers. So that was my first exposure to U.S. culture, although maybe U.S. culture changed a little bit after that. But anyway, so one day in my grandfather's library, I came across a book called Prayer Guide, Namaz Hocası in Turkish. And at the back of the book, there were 3 quotes. And I remember the first one very clearly. It was a quote from the Quran, which said, "It is God who has created you and has given you ears, eyes, and heart." And that was a moving thing for me to hear. Like, God made me, and I should thank God for who I am. But there was another quote, which was not that inspiring, because it said, "If your children do not start to pray at the age of 10, then beat them up." Now, I was at the age of 9, and I said, wow, if I don't really start to pray in a year, I would really be in trouble. That was something. And I remember asking my grandfather about this, and he called me down, "Oh, don't worry about that, we would never do that, and, you'll be fine." But on that very day, I remember a question was carved in my mind, and the question was whether coercion could really bring genuine religiosity. In other words, if you began to pray because you wanted to avoid a slap in your face, would you be really a religious person? Or were you just doing out of the fear of oppression? Now, this question is quite relevant. It was a question for my childhood, but it became actually a quite relevant question in the last decade of the 20th century, or in the first decade of the 21st century, I would say, because these coercive measures in the Islamic world became more and more controversial for understandable reasons. 9/11 made terrorism created in the name of Islam, which I totally denounce, a big concern in the West, understandably. But I would say terrorism of that kind, of Al-Qaeda type, it is quite marginal among world Muslims. The sympathy for that is quite marginal. But there's a broader problem of lack of real liberty. There's a problem of appreciation of liberty in the Muslim world, and that's a broader phenomenon. And maybe that's a phenomenon which underlies some of the militant movements as well. And it is not hard to see that. In the Muslim world, when you look at today, no Muslim majority country in the world is listed as completely free. When you look at the Freedom Index or Freedom House, for example, some are half free, some are not free at all. There are oppressions on minorities, sometimes Muslim minorities, sometimes non-Muslim minorities. There are bans on apostasy, again, which if someone wants to change his religion from Islam to Christianity, he might have big trouble. And there has been cases that they were executed for apostasy. There are bans on blasphemy, and even some critical thinking about Islam or critique towards Islamic culture can be named under blasphemy and punished. There are also coercive measures. Like, if you go to Saudi Arabia, there's this religious police called Mutawwa, and when the prayer time comes, the Mutawwa, with their sticks in their hand, would force you to go to the mosque to do your prayers. At least they would force you to close your shop, as I discovered in Mecca this year, when I was looking for a place to eat something, and prayer time comes and shops have to be closed because the religious police forces on them. Again, here's the question. If you are going to the mosque because the religious police forces you, is it actually a good thing? Shouldn't you go to a mosque because you want to worship God and not because you want to avoid the stick of the religious police? Now, these are, common sense, I think, approaches, but there are deeper reasons why you have these authoritarian coercive elements in the Islamic world. And I'll try to dig them a little bit in the rest of my speech. And I dig deeper in the book, but I'll try to give you a few examples. First of all, I should say this. Not all religious liberty problems in the Muslim world actually come from Islamic law or Islamic mindsets. Sometimes it is secular governments in the Muslim world who suppress religious liberty. I mean, when you look at the Arab Spring, most of the dictators who either fell with the Arab Spring or who are threatened right now with the Arab Spring, like the dictator in Syria, Bashar Assad, they're secular, actually minded leaders. So not every problem therefore then can be traced to Islam theologically. Where I come from, Turkey, for example, it has been secular nationalism more than Islamic piety, which has threatened religious freedom in my country. For example, Christians in Turkey were more free under the Ottoman Empire with their institutions and churches. And some of those institutions and churches have been closed down during the era of the secular republic because of nationalistic considerations, because Christians were seen as the fifth column of the neighboring Greece and so on. So there's a lot of nationalism sometimes behind some of the oppressions on religious freedom. Just to give a personal example of that to you, I have a good friend, Ziya Meral, who's a Turkish convert to Christianity. He's now in his 30s, but at the age of 18, he read the first time he read the New Testament. He was inspired by the message. He was living in Izmir, one of Turkey's most secular cities, and he decided to become a Christian. And his family, who's one of the most secular, represents one of the most secular segments in Turkish society, who had never been to the mosque, they were shocked that he had become a Christian, and they really gave him a hard time, because by being a Christian, he was not a Turk anymore. Because it's in the definition of Turkishness to be a Muslim. If he had become an atheist, it would not be a problem, but becoming a Christian means that he's changing his culture for another culture. So those kind of oppressions on